What I will do to begin with, though, is talk a little bit about the first assignment that you had. Um, there are a couple of things that I noticed with respect to the people who did well and the people who did less well. Okay. And the first thing was, I've talked about this, most of you avoided it, but some of you really leaned into the idea of this is just all of, I already know all this stuff. Whatever anybody says, this is what's true. That is, what I got was your personal opinion based on nothing, no indication of any reading, no indication of having paid attention to anything we were discussing in class. Therefore, no indication of learning and no challenging of your own views at all. It's just, I mean, here's my response to that. If you really are so, if those views for you, especially at such a young age, are so deeply baked in, it really begs the question, what are you doing in college? It really does. And I don't mean that as an indictment. It's just like, aren't you wasting your time? Because you're clearly demonstrating that, at least with respect to social, economic, and political issues, no one can teach you anything. So it's like, why bother? Why don't you just go make money? I mean, I don't know. Be an entrepreneur, sell heroin, do something creative. I don't know. But yet your opinions, I'll say it one more time for what little it's worth. Your opinions are worth even less. They are not a valid currency in academia. They're not. Okay, not my opinions, not your opinions. I am not teaching opinion. There is a difference between opinion and analysis. Okay, what I do is not opinion. I always tell you, like when I'm making fun of Ashland or something like that, because I'm warming up, I will always tell you, yeah, this is my opinion. I think they're silly. That's pretty clear that I'm not yet teaching, that I'm just goofing. I'm just warming up. But if you really expect that you're just going to, something is true because you believe it, and you don't care what anyone says, that there's no way that you can have your mind changed, that doesn't make you smart. And it doesn't make you right. Okay. But it does make you unteachable. And if that's the way you feel about higher education, then you might want to think, well, gee, maybe I don't want to be here. Maybe this is not a very pleasant thing for me. And I'll tell you, some of you are thinking, well, yeah, I wouldn't be here except that I want to get a nice job and make more money. To do that, I have to have a stupid college degree and hang out with you fucking liberals. Well, actually, no, you don't. First of all, most of us aren't liberal, and I'm not a liberal. But beyond that, getting a degree is not going to guarantee you more money anymore. It's not. We are finding that the unemployment rate among college-educated young Americans is persistently high, higher than it would normally have been. I don't think that's going to change. Okay, so if you're going to college simply because you think, you know what, I have to do this, it's like getting vaccinated so that I don't get a disease. This is going to vaccinate me from poverty. It's not. It's not, and it's not even going to guarantee you a middle class status. Okay, that's going to require skill. Now, if you come into a university and you apply yourself and you acquire some discipline, then yeah, you will be more valuable in the workforce. That will help you. But if it's just like, well, I'm going to just get C's and just phone everything in and I'm not going to read it, none of these creeps can teach me anything, you are wasting someone's money and a lot of it. Okay. And I think it's a good time to give that some thought, because it's clear that there were not a lot of you, but there were probably, I would say 5 or 6 at least. You just didn't apply yourself at all. You just kind of made it up as it went along. Okay. Now, somebody asked, did I leave comments? If you got anywhere from about an 8, 5, or 9 up out of 10, no, I probably didn't, because you already know that that's sufficient. Okay. The people I spent most of the time doing comments on were people who did less well, either, kind of what I've just been talking about, or people who it looked like they were trying, but they missed something important and trying to get you to go back and look at things. I know for a fact that, and I know this, by the way, because I can look on Moodle and see who's watching what, most of you did not look at those videos. That's astonishing, because that's your medium. You're a visual people. You're not reading learners in the way that earlier generations were. You get a lot of your information visually rather than just through reading. That's why I made those videos. And one of the things I found is that people who watched those videos did a lot better in the class when I offered them last year. Okay. But also, those things are designed to walk you through things and tell you this is what he's going to emphasize on the exam. I should probably pay attention to this. Okay. So when we get now to, Plato and Aristotle, as silly as those videos are, and yeah, they are, I don't care. I want to have some fun too. But there's a lot of information in there. And I know for a fact that most of you, and it is not, an indictment, it's a fact, most of you are not reading. Okay. That has become a real problem with higher education, is unwillingness or inability of students to read for comprehension at this level. Okay. So the videos are there to help you. Like, okay, I'll watch the video. That'll kind of give me an idea what I'm looking at. Then I'll go look at the notes, or I'll go look at whatever his assigned reading is. So look at the video first, that's fine. It's just, I don't care how you learn. I just want you to have the opportunity to learn. Okay. Another thing in terms of your responses is a lot of you were really unclear in your writing. Okay. If I have to back up and try again, like 3 times before I can figure out, oh, that's what she means. That's what he means. That's not my fault. Okay. This is not a composition class. You are, many of you, going to have to apply yourself more to the task of writing and writing effectively. Okay. Because you still can't get through college if you can't write. And that means at a college level. We're not being snarky. What we're trying to do is help you impose discipline on your thinking, so that when you say something, you're not just blasting out, word salad, but you're actually saying something. I mean, there were fundamental mistakes in really simple grammar and syntax and stuff like that, that were almost, I'm not exaggerating because I've done a little translation. It was almost like translation to try and figure out, wait a minute, what's the meaning here? I gotta look at this again. So some of you, I would suggest, are really going to want to work on your writing some more and work on writing more effectively. Okay. Because that will become a problem as you move into upper division courses. I feel like I'm kind of a downer right now, but it took me a long time to grade these, in part because I got busy, but also because there were many of these that I had to read multiple times at one sitting. Rather than, as I told you, I read them all, I let them sit for a day, I go back, I read them again, then I start to grade them. But there were some that I had to read 5 or 6 times to figure out, what do I do with this? Okay. So, be more conscious of how you're expressing yourself, of the words you use, and think about precision. Okay. Because if all I have as an indication of what you know is what you write, I can't stop you the way I could in here and say, well, wait a minute, could you say that again? Because I don't think I'm understanding you. If all I have is your writing and I don't understand it, think about, it puts me in a weird place. How do I grade this? What if I can't make sense of what you're saying? How do I grade it? I could just give you an F. That was the old school approach to things. If you turned in something at the university level and the professor couldn't understand at a glance what you were trying to say, they flunked you. Okay. Well, we're kinder and gentler now, but, I'm not going to let it slide, because that's going to encourage bad habits. That's going to encourage you to be sloppy in your thinking and sloppy in the way that you express your thinking. And then you will be second tier for the rest of your life. So unless you aspire to militant mediocrity, I would say, try to lean into your writing a little more and be more effective with it, especially with these short answer things. You really got to get in, say it, and get out. Some of you did that magnificently well. You clearly understood, okay, there's a way to say this in 2 or 3 sentences. Okay. One of the problems with clarity too was it was clear that many of you, but I don't think most of you, but enough of you that it concerned me, didn't really prepare before you started the assignment. That you hadn't made notes, you hadn't gone back and reviewed anything, and you had plenty of time to do it this early in the term, right? And so you were unprepared for what really should not have been very surprising prompts. I don't think there was anything I was asking you to do that should have been a surprise, where it was like, man, we didn't talk about that in class. I don't know what he's talking about. Okay. Plus, everything I talked about was not only contained somewhere in our discussions, it was also contained in the videos, and it was also contained in the notes. So you had multiple sources. So, you take advantage of the fact that you can refer back to the classes if you miss notes on something. There are those videos. Those can, jog your memory, help you connect thoughts and things like that. That's important. Okay, so prepare before you do that. And then again, another thing, not all of you used examples very effectively. Sometimes what helped with some of you is I couldn't quite understand what you were saying, but then when you gave me an example, it was like, oh, that's what she means. Okay, well I would have said that differently and I had to fish for it, so it ain't an A, but you know what? Yeah, that's probably above average understanding of that when I think about it. Yeah. All right, so are there any questions on the assignment, the first assignment? Your grades are there. I wanted to finish them on Saturday, but I just got busy. But anyway, that wasn't too long.
Moodle, for some reason, I don't know what it is, but like those little progress checkboxes next to each link, those don't work for me for some reason.
Progress
Like
checkboxes.
yeah, there's like little checkboxes that say, when you've clicked on a link or an assignment or notes, and like in your other class, it'll, check it off as completed. For some reason, all of those are blank for me.
I don't
So like even though I've clicked on all
I
the,
think you could just click on the little box.
oh, so you have to like do it yourself?
Yeah, because for
Oh,
some of my classes it did that, but sometimes you just have to do it manually.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
That explains it.
It's just a default setting that there's a reason why I'm doing this, because I'm trying to monitor and see how Moodle performs with different settings. And so I'm leaving those in a certain status right now. But it doesn't ultimately affect much, really. It's just sort of a kind of a bookkeeping thing, really. But I wouldn't worry about it, unless as a consequence of that you're encountering a problem with completing assignment or something like that. Then that would be the only reason to be concerned about it. And that should not happen. That shouldn't happen. All right. Anything else before we go back to the subject matter of the class? Okay. So just things to think about, for the next assignment, which will obviously be something on Plato and Aristotle. All right. We talked a little bit about Plato's Republic. Actually, we talked quite a bit about it in terms of the outline of it and everything. And the idea of looking at how he magnifies the individual elements of the soul and puts them into these different sort of social classes or strata of society in the city, okay? But I want to remind you that he's not talking about like lower class, middle class, upper class. These aren't socioeconomic classes. These are people divided by their nature, okay? He believes in the idea that people are naturally predisposed toward a certain kind of function in a society, and that the purpose of the healthy republic is to help them identify that and then pursue that life, that most of us will be, producers, that we're clever and we're motivated to seek wealth or to invent things or whatever it is. And so, we're going to make the products of a society. Some of us are less like that, less individualistic, more concerned with honor and sacrifice. And so we're natural, we're natural warriors or auxiliaries. And then a rare few of us will be suited by our philosophical temperament and our capacity to achieve wisdom and apply it to governing. That tiny stratum of people will be the rulers, out of which we will find, usually a philosopher king of some kind. Okay, that's pretty much the republic. In terms of what we're interested in for the class, but I would refer you to the notes there. Now, has anybody had a chance to look ahead and either look at the video on Aristotle or read any of the notes on Aristotle's Politics? Okay. Lily, do you have your hand up? I can't. Oh, you do. Okay. Anything jump out at you there that might, among other things, show us how different Aristotle's thinking is from Plato's, first of all? Anything that you remember once you unmute your microphone, which you have not done.
Sorry, it's having some issues.
Okay.
I mean, there was one thing. Instead of using like classes, he separated by deliberative, executive, and judicial.
Okay, that's just divisions of government. But remember that Aristotle is very different in that he very much understands the reality of socioeconomic class. Look at all of his emphasis on the middle class. You understand? I mean, you're right, Lily, with respect to the way that he divides government. And it's not exactly the kind of countervailing power, three branches of government that we have. Don't be confused by that. It's easy for Americans to be confused by that. That's not really quite what he means. What he means is that there are some parts of government that are best left to a democracy. Okay. There are other parts of government that probably would be best decided by an oligarchy. Okay. And it depends on, among other things, does it have to do with property rights or something like that? Like if there's a dispute in a society over property rights, his idea is, well, property rights really are only relevant to those who have significant property, and they're also going to understand the issues better. So those kinds of property disputes should be decided by the property holding class, which is essentially an oligarchy, right? But if we're talking about whether or not someone's guilty of a crime against the entire community should sit in judgment on that, which would be like what we do with a jury. Everyone sitting on a jury represents the community in which an offense was committed, okay? And, he's in Athens at that time, that jury system was in place. It was a jury by lot, generally speaking. It was a very large body of people. They would meet in the square in the so-called agora, and they would hear testimony, and then they would, give, thumbs up or thumbs down or whatever it was, okay? Have any of you ever served on a jury? I finally got picked for a grand jury over the summer. It was 2 months. And we were hearing somewhere between, I would say, I think the easiest day we had was 18 cases. The longest day was 32 in a day. And all a grand jury does, because a lot of people don't understand this, a grand jury does not sit in a courtroom and hear testimony from both sides. The purpose of a grand jury, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is because of things that you're hearing in the news, about the Breonna Taylor case and things like that. That case has not been heard before a jury in a courtroom yet. When they say grand jury, what they mean is that a group of citizens from the community within which the offense occurred, right, meet under the auspices of the district attorney's office, representing the state, to determine whether or not the state has sufficient evidence to go to trial and prosecute a case. And it's up to the grand jury to decide whether or not that's the case. And at least in the case of Jackson County, where we are here, if the grand jury says no, then we issue what's called a not true bill. And that means that person who they're trying to charge cannot be indicted for that crime. And that does happen in a grand jury, okay? So a lot of people, when they heard the grand jury's findings in Breonna Taylor's murder, were saying, well, there's something wrong with that grand jury. No, there probably isn't, okay? Just keep in mind, the grand jury is kind of a creature of the district attorney's office. It's put together for the prosecution of a case. We don't hear any evidence for the defense. We don't hear from the defendant. We only hear from arresting officers, investigators, and occasionally victims of crime or alleged crime, okay? So that's what's going on there. Now, that kind of modern institution is very much derived from this Aristotelian notion that, well, if it's harm done to the community should judge guilt or innocence, okay? So the notion of jury trial is a way of including the community in the application of criminal justice and civil justice, okay? So that's what he's talking about there. But more importantly, the distinction that he makes that Plato completely ignores with his, like, he lumps all the producers together, okay? Clearly, Aristotle doesn't see it that way. In other words, he's got a view that almost seems modern compared to Plato's, and certainly seems more realistic, where he's saying you know, the problem with most either very small or very large cities is they either have like a very powerful oligarchy, but rich people with lots of power, whose power is greater even than the greater numbers of the poor, or they have so many people who are poor that they can challenge through democracy, right? They can challenge the limited power of an oligarchy. But what he's saying is that the city that is most likely to be stable and healthy and productive is a city in which there is a very large middle class. So this notion of socioeconomic class means a lot to him. Now, what I want you to look for in the notes is why. Why does he think that the middle class is so important? Because again, I'll remind you that even today, in the social sciences, everyone still talks about the importance of the middle class. And where there's a crisis of the middle class, that's where people get worried. Even more so than a crisis of the poor, okay? And America is a classic example of that. One of the reasons, for example, why we are hearing so much now about police violence, okay? It isn't that it hasn't always been going on, okay? Because the police have been being militarized since approximately 1980, at least. So it's not a new thing, but it's more visible to the middle class, and more particularly the white middle class, because we're beginning to see it in the suburbs. And we used to only see it in inner cities, which were disproportionately poor and non-white, you know, over say the last 40 years or so. But now it's becoming visible and we're starting to see it. Also because of things like, you know, smartphones and things like that, people on the street in those areas where these events are occurring are capturing this stuff on video. This was way before your time, but one of the keys to the Rodney King case was that another just citizen had a small portable video camera and captured a lot of the beating of Rodney King by multiple police officers, okay? Now, again, it didn't catch the high-speed chase or his initial resistance or any of that stuff. So it's not, I mean, cameras don't lie, but they don't necessarily tell all the truth any more than people do, okay? But since
you're talking about that video where he's getting like pulled out of the truck, is that the one that you're referring to?
Several police officers and they're just wailing on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that ultimately yielded a change of venue to Simi Valley, which was overwhelmingly white, and acquittal of the officers, followed by very violent riots. What a surprise, you know. And some indications that the governor of California was content to let it burn. You know, there were a lot of things that were disturbing about that. But the main thing is all of it was visible to us. We saw it on television. We saw, it's like Vietnam. People wonder, well, you know, what happened? What went wrong with Vietnam? We saw it in our living rooms every day on television. Okay. That is the threat of a democracy, of mobilizing the middle class. Okay. Because the idea of the middle class, according to Aristotle, that I want you to look for is the middle class represents the richest of the poor and the poorest of the rich. Okay. And so the idea is that they don't take sides either with the poor against the rich or with the rich against the poor. That because it's particularly when it's a large middle class, right? There are these countervailing interests within that class so that, like he says, they don't hold grudges. Well, what he means by that is there's not that deep-seated resentment and anger against the wealthy for what the poor don't have. There's not that dread and fear of the poor that the rich have so that they lock themselves away and try to control everything. You know, this is the middle class, right? In other words, wealth, they're aware of wealth. They're also aware of poverty. To some extent, those things are visible around them. They may have come from poverty into the middle class. They may have fallen from wealth into the middle class. But either way, they share the values of both the poor and the rich. They balance them out. And so the main theme to keep in mind with Aristotle is this idea of balance. It's that classic Athenian notion of the mean between extremes. That is, if you want to develop a social system, an economy, a political system, art, anything, you have to find the mean between extremes. If you go too far in any one direction, everything's thrown out of balance and you lose harmony. When you lose harmony, you engender chaos. When you have chaos, things fall apart. Okay, so he's saying where you have a large middle class, there's a political system that's better for it. Okay, but if you don't have that middle class, then you have two options. Okay, one of them is an oligarchy and one of them is democracy. Okay, that's his thinking. Now, what I'd like you to look for is the reasoning behind his thinking. Why does he say that? Okay. One of the reasons has to do with the way that Aristotle does something, again, very modern. This is why he's sometimes considered to be not the first political philosopher, but the first political scientist. And what he does is he sits down and says, okay, there are these, he's looked at different kinds of regimes. He's read about them. He's read their histories and everything else. And he has this taxonomy of all these different kinds of, government styles. He breaks them down into three ideal forms, and then their corrupt forms. Now, if you haven't watched the video yet, I walk through this, but I'm going to just explain it to you now, and then the video can kind of reinforce that. What he does is he says there's essentially three ways you can do this. One is the rule of the best person. One, that's a monarch or a king. Okay, so that notion of monarchy that's sort of the most ideally divine form. In a sense, what he's doing is he's talking about Plato's philosopher king. Okay, but unlike Plato, who really believes that that's the only good system, he's concerned that, well, in theory, it's the best system. It's subject to corruption. And it's the corruption of the self-interest of the monarch. Plato never talks about this. Aristotle makes sure we understand that happens. And when you have a corrupt, self-interested single leader, what you have is a tyranny. That is someone who rules by force, someone who rules illegitimately, okay, and they rule in their own interest. Because I don't care, I want to be king. I want to be, prime minister. I want to be president or whatever. And I'll do whatever I have to do. I don't care how it affects, the principality or the kingdom or the republic or whatever I'm in. I want to be in power. That's a tyrant. Okay. The second ideal form of government is when you have the rule not by the best individual. You sort of concede that, you're just not going to find the philosopher king. All right, well, what about the class of people out of whom the philosopher king might rise? And that would be the wisest people. So the rule of the wisest people, which is a small group of people in any society, the best educated, the most temperate, the most philosophically astute, is an aristocracy. And that's ruled by the best, not the richest. And this isn't what we mean with aristocracy, what we're talking about is what's called sometimes a landed aristocracy. Your power comes from your control over land. The aristocracy that Aristotle's talking about is people who rule because they're wise. They're the wisest. They're the best of a society because of their wisdom. Okay? And so that would be the second best form of government. But it's also subject to corruption. Now, what would cause corruption if personal interests of the monarch would cause corruption leading to tyranny? What kind of corruption could destroy the wisdom of an aristocracy? Who would be corrupt?
The wisest people.
Okay, but they're wise. How could they possibly become corrupt? Interest for the class. Yeah, Chase just said it becomes a class interest. In other words, the fear is initially they might govern on the basis of their wisdom, but the fear is they would become corrupt by their own desire to continue in power, and therefore they might depart from wisdom, and instead they might govern in a way that simply enhanced their power. Okay, now what you have there is you have that sort of the corrupt form of that, the self-interested class that declines from an aristocracy would be an oligarchy. That is just the rule of a small group of people, usually the wealthiest. Okay, technically speaking, rule of the wealthy would be a plutocracy. But never mind. Just think of it as because that's what Aristotle refers to it as, is an oligarchy. It's a rule of the few, and they rule. And again, they rule in order to enhance their own interests, to pursue and enhance their own interests, which is corrupt. Okay. The third form of government, and this is the one that really is best suited to a society that has a large middle class, is called a polity, sometimes referred to as a politeia, the Greek word. And a polity is sort of the enlightened rule of the many under a constitution. Okay, so what this means is that the rule of the many means that not everybody's going to make every decision, but everybody's going to be involved in some kind of decision. Okay, the constitutional arrangement of power will create institutions that will allow for that. So that this is what Lily was talking about earlier that got us going here. Was she got us off to a good start with the idea of him kind of describing the politeia, that you have this balance of interests where the interest of the community to be safe and to be secure under the law, that's an interest of the entire community. So when that's violated, there has to be an institutional process through which the community can stand in judgment against the alleged violator of that security. Okay, again, that gets back to something like jury trial or something like that. If there's a property dispute, that's going to be different. If you're trying to make decisions, legislative decisions, what kind of policy or law are we going to have? That's not going to be decided by everybody because there are too many conflicting interests. So you're going to probably defer to something like an aristocracy for that. You're going to look for the wisest people to be able to make those decisions. Okay. He explains it a little bit in the notes, or whoever did the notes explains it. The main thing is there are multiple institutions of authority. Each is legitimate within its own sphere of interest. Okay. But no one institution then is subject to complete corruption. And so the entire government can't be totally corrupted as easily because institutional power is divided up. You know, again, sometimes it's a democracy. It's the people standing in judgment. Sometimes it's elite rule because you're making law and that needs, you know, a small number of people and so on. Okay. But even that can be corrupted. And where it's most likely to be corrupted is if you have a small middle class and a large number of poor people, or you have a very abusive, you know, group of elite rich people. Okay. And then what happens is, what tends to happen there is there are almost always more poor people than there are rich people. You might as well just fill in always and take out the word almost there. As a consequence of that, the corrupt form of a polity is democracy. And that means rule of the poor, essentially. You know, so it's rule of the many at the expense of the wealthy. It's anti-elite, it's anti-wealthy. You know, the poor are going to try to take away the wealth of the rich. It was the biggest concern, really, of aristocrats at that time, that there were so many people who were poor, and this would become obvious when, you know, there was a famine or there was disease, or there was a bad fortune in war or something like that, that the poor would really suffer. And the concern is once they healed up from that suffering a little bit, they could rebel and they could overthrow the much smaller oligarchy of rich people who controlled the land and everything else. So again, corrupt form of monarchy is tyranny, self-interested monarch. Corrupt form of aristocracy, rule of the wisest, is simply rule of the few who have the most power, usually because of their wealth, oligarchy. And then the ideal form for a balanced society with a large middle class, you know, where all the interests of a society are taken into account in some form and balanced, is a polity. The corrupt form of that, for Aristotle, is a democracy, which is essentially rule of the mob. Okay? Now, are there any questions on that? Okay, that's really the core of his thinking. This and what you should see there is, what I want you to think about is how is that different from Plato's Republic? Because remember that, you know, Aristotle had been for a short time a student of Plato. All right. He had learned from Plato, but then he had subsequently rejected many of the philosophical assumptions of Plato, including Plato's conviction of the existence of the ideal forms and all that stuff. Aristotle kind of tosses that out the window. He's much more of what's called an empiricist. He wants to observe these phenomena and record them systematically and then draw conclusions from them. He's also got experience as a botanist, an early kind of scientist, what's called a natural philosopher. That's what became science. You'll hear people archaically refer to natural philosophy. What they're really talking about is rudimentary science. Okay, that's what Aristotle is bringing to this political question that really Plato largely ignores. Because Plato is an idealist in his philosophy. He's a moral idealist. Aristotle is much more realistic, even though there is moral to what he's doing, the idea of balancing between extremes and things like that. But he tries to make a case beyond just saying, well, everybody knows that's right. You know, he's trying to show how, yeah, we might want to have a polity. That might be a great, in theory, that might be a great system. But if you don't have a large middle class, forget about it. It's not going to work. And yeah, you know, a philosopher king might be great, but you're asking for corruption. And so ultimately, you're asking for tyranny. That was the concern that somebody like Aristotle would have. Okay, so I want you to be able to read those things, get through there, look at the basic assumptions in the notes, probably take a look at those videos. And then what I'd like you to be able to do is make notes and write down questions, because what I'd like to be able to do, if we're ready, is review on Wednesday and then possibly have another assignment over the weekend. But if we're not ready, we won't do it. I want you to make an effort to be ready though, okay? So is it clear what I'm asking you to do? Most of you haven't had a chance yet. I understand there was a weekend, that's fine. I like, regroup, rest your brains, but I want you to finish looking at Plato and look at that video on justice. Then look at the notes on Aristotle after maybe first looking at the video. That might unlock things a little more, okay? Any questions? All right, then I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
have a good day.